Good morning, students, teachers. We have some bright sunlight coming in on this April morning of 2021. So my face is going to be like lit from the side. Where to put the lights. This is important in filmmaking, but also in ray tracing. What I'm going to talk about a little bit here is how I connect learning to program, learning to code with doing visual output. And there's no reason to reinvent the wheel here. This open source ray tracer, for example, called povray, is extremely capable. So my technique has been to introduce the computations, like how to do number series, like triangular numbers, and other series like that, similar to Conway and Guy's book, The Book of Numbers. And then, after the computation layer is clear, you've got a sort of how to write that stuff out. I'm not showing such code here at the moment, but how to write stuff like that, how to write visuals by writing scene description language. In other words, povray doesn't know Python, but using something like Python or any language you want to learn, like Julia, Clojure, the point is to write out in another language that povray can then understand. Now, this is something I've been doing for a really long time, and I think pretty much everyone who's been on the EduSig, SIG stands for Special Interest Group. Applewhite kind of paused at that at one point. I figured out later why, because he had some associations on SIG, I guess. But, SIG graphics, and, we've had that going for a long time. And that page I just showed you, this is from year 2000, right? So it's 20 years old by now. Now here's this Python conference coming up, a virtual conference, and I did propose for it. I did not expect to be in the main schedule with an obscure talk like I had, and I'm correct. The full schedule's been published, and I'm off the hook for being there. Now there is an education summit that goes alongside the conference, and it could be that on the basis of my proposal, I'll get a little extra time to talk at some point, but it doesn't really matter because I can have these videos out there asynchronous and not crush on the schedule, right? I can be obliging by sharing the content with everybody, doing all this, you could say on the side, and then people who are interested can consult the materials because it is obscure, as we discussed in the previous. Even though my technique probably of writing scene description language and doing renderings of polyhedron stuff, even though that may seem pretty straightforward, you can also use Blender if you're doing the Python world. Blender is a 3D animation package where you can script it in Python. It's designed for that. And I've got videos talking some about that, right? But the geometry that I'm using in the first place, what I'm using as inspiration to spit out various renderings, this is not very much studied in any university that I'm aware of. So there's sort of a subculture around the margins. And we consult with each other, we have meetups, there's been conferences, exchange of emails, there's a lot of chatter. So it's a true cohesive, I'd say, subculture. One thing we've been doing, or I've been doing in consultation with these peers, including by joining meetups, talking on Facebook and stuff, is kind of a rewrite of the synergetics page. This one that's covering fuller synergetics. Towards the top, anyway, the opening paragraphs. We've got some famous names in our world famous that weren't there, and you might say, well, they weren't doing synergetics. especially Kenneth Snelson, would probably rebel against the idea that what he was doing was synergetics. Partly that's semantics, right? We don't know what synergetics is in some degree because one person, Bucky, typifying a synergetic scholar, what do you do to advance synergetics? Maybe you interject new wildlife into an ecosystem because you've given it study, right? It's a system science in a sense. So you're studying systems, but you're also bringing to bear kind of a right brain primitive vocabulary of geometric shapes, kind of like when you're a kid and they give you those blocks to play with or Legos. Synergetics implies kind of a childhood Sesame Street like experience with this neighborhood of related polyhedra, and their volumes is also important. And all that is in the background in my Python proposal and is very obscure. But I was showing like what's not obscure are certain coding techniques like using povray. So I'm just going to introduce povray right here. That's the ray tracer I was talking about just now. So if I wanted to have that as part of my markdown, I could do something like, let's see, probably instead of that section, I'll put it, oh, there it is, povray. So what I'll do, Python plus povray, is just put a link. So how is that done in Python in Markdown? You put the word you want highlighted, like the hyperlink text, in square brackets, and then in immediately following in parentheses, you put the URL, povray.org, in parentheses and without quotes. And that should do it for you. Now to test that, it immediately shows up down below here. I can click and say open in a new tab and just make sure that that link works okay, and I think it's going to work. So then, there it is. See, this is the kind of thing you can do in povray. These are renderings. These are not photographs, right? So I'm way less competent and complex in my curriculum to get off the ground. I mean, if you're studying just a pure geometry and you get off into becoming a full-scale POV ray tracer artist kind of guy, or by guy, by the way, I don't mean any particular gender, but person, more power to you. Same with Blender. All of these are like doors opening into whole worlds that you could schedule. So I'm happy with this. I'll leave it in case the Education Summit people want to call it up. I don't know how long this will stay in the world, but it's good to have just as an historical record, Martian math. Which reminds me, this will be my last topic today. I'm gonna enjoy, I think, a meetup coming up. Let's see, what's the fastest way to get to the meetup? Meetups.com, where we're going to talk about science fiction. No, that's not it. How about meetup.com? This is with the Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society, I think it's called. And someone proposed that we talk today about the importance of science fiction. Here we go. Science fiction, a tool for engaging empathy and morality in our society. And for me, it's also going to be a didactic thing. Now it starts at 10:30. It's coming right up. It's going to be using science fiction not only to sort of scope out the utopia, dystopia. We're going into the future. We're trying to forecast like bats. We're like radar ahead, sweeping, trying to figure out what's probable, what's possible, where can we make a difference, how can we guide ourselves into a better future. Well, first of all, there's all this imagination that goes on thinking about the future. But we can also deliberately construct what I'll call exhibits with a futuristic flavor that are designed to help us learn the general principles, say, of electricity. which is what we do in my Martian math. We talk a lot about hydropower generation or just electrical grids in general. We're giving people a foundation of what I'll call grid talk, which is infrastructure talk, which is world game talk. On that score, I'll end with a funny bonus feature. Is there such a thing as white math? And this comes from Substack, and it's posted to Quora, and this was posted long enough ago. Where's the date on this anyway? That it's collected a lot of comments by now, right? I still don't see a date. I don't know how long this has been posted, but I decided to weigh in, and I say, I have played in kind of a satirical sense with what's racist about the math we teach in terms of the XYZ coordinate system having 3 positive vectors that can, by themselves, can only reach 1 octet of XYZ space, right? You know XYZ, right? 3 mutually orthogonal. It's kind of a cross, so what about the negative non-basis vectors? They do the same amount of work, but they're not basis vectors, right? They're just secondary, non-basis vectors. And this is kind of an introduction to quadray coordinates, which is on Wikipedia. I'm kind of doing a little I don't even put a link in the comment. I don't think you can. But if you go like Wikipedia quadrays, you know what that takes you to, right? I've been doing this for a while here. Again, POV ray or ray tracers, they come in useful for this kind of study. It's partly how I had the intellectual property, literally, in the sense of I made these graphics, so I don't have to get permission. Somebody gets mad at me, they revoke permission. I hope they don't, right? Because sometimes, I include, excerpts from things. I think in accordance with, the conventions of copyright. I'm not trying to rip anybody off here, but see, those kinds of considerations would not come up if I did the graphics. And that's what I did. Like, these graphics have been around since the 90s, and I could do synergetics on the web and other websites because I was autonomous enough with my coding language, which might have been FoxPro at first, and my ray tracer, which is free open source ray tracer. So what comes out the end of my pipeline, I can legitimately say, hey, this is mine to do with as I please, and I do, right? So, and I want to give others that same freedom, right? To make your own cartoons, your own animations, your own stills, your own GIFs, your own JPEGs, and share those. But to create a world like that, where you have all that computer power, that's where I get less satirically, right? So I introduced quadray coordinates as having 4 basis vectors, and we don't discriminate that 3 of them are basis and 1 of them is secondary or so on. They're all basis vectors, and they're independent in the sense that you don't need their negatives to do anything, and you don't need, therefore, to use any kind of negation or rotation to point the other way. 4 vectors from the center is sufficient in linear combinations to positively fill space. We don't need to introduce 2 classes of vector, basis and non-basis here. We have 4 equal basis vectors. There's no 2 tiers. There's no, some people get all the acknowledgement, I guess you could say. But that doesn't have to be racist. That could be sexist, right? Anyway, less satirically, it's where we put a fence between math, as we call it, and computer science, which it takes more. Even there, we're proud about how you don't need equipment. If you just want to learn computer science, we put a premium on just paper and pencil or just a chalkboard or something, because everyone can have that supposedly in school, and that's the even playing field or whatever. But if we put more technology into this picture and say, hey, but we want to do ray tracings, we want to do animations, doing math, we want to do fractals. We actually want to use computers. We actually want hands-on access to file systems, to the cloud. If mathematics culturally took more in terms, if it costs more than football, as I put it, and if you didn't have that, you couldn't be said to be learning our curriculum. Like, you need those toys to learn our curriculum. And therefore, the issue about equity that people try to get at in math education, it will leap into the foreground if you allow your definition of math to be somewhat malleable. In other words, make it include computing with equipment, right? Just like music doesn't just mean tapping with your fingers on a table, right? Wow, it might even include a flute. Imagine that. Because if we were to do that, if we were to think that we're not really fulfilling our obligation to educate anyone in math, if we're not giving them a safe personal workspace, access thereto, whether they own it or not, it's not necessarily. You go to a sky tower or skyscraper somewhere full of equipment and you're assigned a carol. Maybe you live in the same building on some other floor, mixed use. In any case, you've got access to what you need to learn math and make YouTubes or make videos, which you then upload to the school server, let's say, in this science fiction. So you get my picture. Higher living standards, universal basic scholarships. It's an education automation by Buckminster Fuller. Check it out. Hope you enjoyed this video. We'll see you next time.